And I will go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, for being with us. It is being recorded now. And I'm leaving the floors to you, kindly.
Okay. Perfect. Here, I'm just going to share my screen. Let me get this going. Hopefully you can see my slides. You're good?
Yes, we can see very good and very interesting.
Perfect. Excellent. Oh, and actually, before I get too far along, let me do one more thing, which is make sure that I have computer sound shared on, because I might share a video if I have that chance. Oops, let me go back.
Yes.
Uh-oh, that didn't work. Hang on. Try that again. Sorry. Apologies. Yeah, let me do that again.
Okay, no worries.
I don't know what happened. There we are. All right, there it goes. We'll just roll with that. So thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to chat with all of you. Just a brief self-description. So I am a kind of middle-aged white woman. I have a shoulder-length dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, and I'm wearing a pair of circular purple and pink kind of funky glasses. And I'm sitting in a room with a bunch of bookshelves behind me and a bunch of books, very messy bookshelves, frankly. I also just want to say I am going to be speaking very extemporaneously. So I'm going to be talking from the screen, and hopefully I don't talk too fast. And by the way, if I go over time, please just tell me or cut me off. I could talk forever about this stuff, because once I get going on the open plan office, I can't stop. I get very excited about it. And that's how research should be, right? At the best. I also want to
appreciate your enthusiasm.
Sorry?
We appreciate your enthusiasm.
Thank you. Hopefully it gives a little energy to the class.
Very energetic.
A little yeah. I also want to acknowledge or say that I am based at Purdue University, which is what's called a land grant university in the United States. It is located in West Lafayette, Indiana, and it was built upon the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Miami, and the Shawnee people. And I wish to honor those original stewards of this land and acknowledge the legacy of violent dispossession that is the underpinning of the growth and the wealth of my home institution, which in turn has enabled and supported this research on the Open Plan Office. So I even though this is a very historic issue, I see it as having a direct influence and relevance to the things that I do in my own work. So this is a talk based on the history, my research on the history of the Open Plan Office, a design concept that really emerged in America in the late 1960s and dramatically changed offices and really became quite popular through the 70s and 80s in a pretty profound way. And what you see on the screen actually is an example of such an open plan. This is an image from a furniture manufacturer called Hayworth. So this is an office interior, and you can see the sort of modular furniture, the kind of lack of offices, of fully enclosed offices, that is the hallmark of an open plan. And that just brings us to the question, what is an open plan? And actually, I'm curious, I don't know if any of you have any of you ever worked in an open plan? Do you want to give me like a thumbs up that you have? Can you emote for me? Can you give me like a little reaction? Anyone? Yeah, so at least one person you have.
Yes, I have worked in an open plan.
They're so ubiquitous, right? They are everywhere. They are very common. They are certainly not unique to America by any means, although my focus is on, of course, the American open plan. But one of the things that I talk about in my book is how nebulous this concept of open planning is. What is an open plan? It is sort of everywhere and nowhere. It is everything and nothing.
Everything and nothing.
Right? It's such an ambiguous concept, and this is something where, and I say this as someone who has spent a lot of time now, like 20 years, I guess at this point, almost 20 years, working on the history of the open plan for my dissertation research as a graduate student through my book, that I continue to sort of marvel at its ambiguity. So I would say in my research, I kind of come down to a few key elements that really define what an open plan is. First, it's an unpartitioned office interior, just a space with no walls, right? This is the most architectural kind of definition, very baseline, and is frankly quite old. This is not something that was invented in the 60s by any means. They go all the way back even to the 19th century. We see big, large, unpartitioned interiors. Think a factory, right? It's a big open plan, basically, often. It is also a method or a way of going about office design that really focuses on communication, and sort of even, you might even say, a philosophy of office design that centers communication as the sort of nexus, as the most important feature of an office. And I will talk about that. And then, of course, lastly, it is a furniture type. What's known as open plan furniture or systems furniture. And what you see on the screen is an example of that. This is Herman Miller's Action Office. I will be talking more about Action Office, but this is a furniture concept that you can see here deployed actually in an architectural open plan. You can see there are no full height walls in this interior. All of the space is created mainly through the furnishings, right? The furniture is creating these kind of individual workstations. The furniture is doing the work, right, of creating the space. And that's another kind of iteration of what we think of as an open plan design. So in my talk today, I'm going to start by giving the kind of broad strokes of my book and talking a little bit about what this kind of history of the open plan, where it came from, and a little bit about the kind of major themes of my book. But then we're going to dive into the issue of technology, which I know is what you all read about and talked about. And so we're going to kind of use this as a way into thinking about the problem of specifically computers in the office. And you'll note there is a computer right here on this desk. So keep an eye out for technology, because it's going to be a recurring theme as we go through this conversation today. Yeah. So first of all, so what was before the open plan? What did offices look like when the open plan first emerged in the 60s? And the answer is what we kind of in America call conventional office design. These were offices where there was a mix of these fully enclosed private offices for mostly executives, managers, and other kind of higher ups, right? And here you can see this example. This is from SOM's Lever House. This is in New York City from the 1950s. And you can see here this very elegant kind of executive office. There's an executive desk, a nice cushy armchair, side chairs, this beautiful, gracious view of the city, right? This is a space of power. It's a space of hierarchy and status. Sorry?
Status.
Yeah. Yeah, status, exactly. This is really emblematic of that. And then on the other side, this is the same building, but this is kind of where clerical workers were. This is what's known as a bullpen. And here you could see these kind of open interiors, right? Open plan, basically. Open interiors with just rows and rows and rows of workers at desks, kind of working away, often all facing in one direction, heavily supervised, surveilled, if you will. And this is very standard kind of design that we see in buildings across the United States built in this mid-20th century period. This is important because this is kind of a big period of time for office building. This is the post-war era in America was a time of enormous economic growth. There was a lot of the companies were kind of flush with cash, and they were investing a lot of resources in building these new buildings. And so you get a lot of new offices actually built in this period that look something like this. So when I talk about the open plan and its intervention or its transformation, I usually say that there are kind of two major influences on the open plan as we kind of understood it in the late 1960s in America. And the first of those is something called office landscaping. This was a design concept that was created by a pair of German brothers named Eberhard and Wolfgang Schnell. And they were actually not designers. They were management consultants who were really interested in the problem of communication in the office. And they really envisioned an office that centered communication in an entirely new way. And so what they did is they took this concept of the architectural open plan, and this is actually an example of this, a wide open, unpartitioned space, very, very large in size, no walls, right? No walls at all, and arranged the entire organization or the entire office in this space using just very simple furniture, desks and file carts, plants, curving screens, in this very, very loose amorphous configuration. You'll notice it isn't very grid-like. It is hard to read, in fact. When you're looking down, you see all the desks and chairs. It looks very like it's just swirling of activity of desks and so on. And this was a feature, not a bug, for the for the Quick Corner team. They really wanted to embrace this idea of the kind of loose, open office interior. And for them, the real goal of all of this, of course, was communication. They believed that walls were barriers, literal barriers to communication, and that just by getting rid of walls and arranging people in a looser way around patterns of communication specifically, people would communicate better, that organizations would function better as a result. So this is one important kind of precursor. And it takes off. It starts in the late 1950s when they first start doing it. But through the 60s, we see, a Quick Corner team working throughout Western Europe. Their ideas are kind of spreading across Europe. And in 1967, they do their very first American office landscaping at the DuPont offices, to the Freon division of the DuPont offices, so just one floor of a building. But it got enormous attention and really kind of rapidly really excited a lot of architects and designers in America as they saw this new concept kind of really taking hold. The second and parallel concept that I would say is the other branch of open plan of its DNA, its essential DNA. The Quick Corner team is one. The other is that Herman Miller's Action Office. And this was a furniture concept that came out also in the late 1960s in America, that used these partitions to support a kind of modular collection of storage elements and work surfaces that could be arranged in these really kind of interesting configurations in these kind of open environments. Action Office was the brainchild of Herman Miller's research division, headed by designer and sort of, he was sort of a jack of all trades in a lot of ways, a man named Robert Probst, who had this vision that Herman Miller's design could really transform what offices were and what offices did. And he was really interested in understanding work, the needs of the worker, the kind of the philosophy of work itself. And he was really drawn to a number of changes that were underway in American business and sought to really upend the way that offices were designed, away from those conventional offices, their rows of private offices and these kind of rows of desks, and instead towards this much more fluid, much more kind of human-centered kind of office interior. And in this image, you can see this is actually an late 1960s Action Office installation, and we're kind of peering over a set of panels here. And you can see here's a gentleman working at his desk, and you can see the kind of flipper drawers. Another gentleman over here working, facing the other direction. You can see the screens are there to both provide a little privacy, a little bit of enclosure, but it's a very open interior, no full height walls, so people can easily communicate. At least that is the idea. And of course, this book that I have up here, this is The Office, a Facility Based on Change, and I actually have my own copy right here, the manifesto that Robert Probst wrote to describe his concept of the office. And by the way, if you ever get your hands on this, it's really quite a document, just of all of his ideas about how he was thinking about work, how he was imagining this new system furniture would work in an office, and all the kind of ideals that it represented. By the early 1970s and in mid 1970s, the open plan had really become rapidly mainstream. So what began actually as this very progressive kind of forward thinking office design concept quickly becomes something that we see in American offices all over. They are just popping up, and architects and designers are amazingly drawn to this new concept and are promoting it very, very heavily. And organizations are really drawn to it because it's cost efficient and cost effective, and it does all these things that make it attractive for organizations, and even in some cases seen as potentially desirable to workers because it was supposed to do all of these very progressive things. And this is something that I think a lot about in my own research, which is this tension between these ideals of the open plan and their failures, the things that went wrong. So this is really the centerpiece of my book, where I sort of trace this history and try to understand, first of all, why were they so excited about the open plan? What did the open plan represent to architects and designers who were promoting it? Why was it so appealing, so exciting? And all the ways in which the open plan failed to do the things that it promised. And so I sort of take these ideals piece by piece, and I try to sort of explore those ideals and understand them in their context and understand what was motivating them. And then I rip them apart and say, actually, here's all the things that were wrong. Just, if you do have a chance to read my book, you will see there's a cadence to it, because I set up, here's the problem, or here's the ideal, here's all the problems that emerge. On this image, actually, you see the cover image of my book. And I love this image so much because I think it is so representative of those ideals of the open plan. An open office is imagined as the space kind of unfettered by architecture, unconstrained by architecture, that allows these workstations to be arranged freely in space, that facilitates individual work, and while also facilitating and supporting communication, that allows for rapid and immediate change to the organization, that allows personalization, allows workers to adapt the space to their personal working needs and their personal preferences, that supports kind of changing technology, put a pin in that, we will come back to it, and supporting movement, right? The circulation of people in space. And so we see all of these ideals kind of really, kind of held up as the future of the office, and supported even as it becomes very clear, frankly, by the late 70s, that the promises of the open plan were not what they had been imagined to be. So that's kind of the kind of arc of the book itself and some of the themes that I explore. But as I said, I'm going to quickly shift to talking about the technology piece, because I do think this is such an important question. And in fact, in my view, this is in some ways one of the most interesting aspects of the problem of the open plan. Well, I should say the ideals and the problems, if you will, because it's not that the designers of the open plan never imagined computers in the office at all. It's just that the way that they imagined computers to be in the office didn't quite live up to how they actually were. And part of this is connected to, I think, another important theme of my book in general, which is about change, the change over time that we see. Very often in design history, and designers too, but design historians especially, we sometimes enshrine the first iteration of something as the end point, right? We look at the architectural photographs of the original design, we say, oh, that's it, that's what it was. And then we never think about, well, what happened 10 years later, 20 years later, or in the case of the image on the screen, 30 years later. And here, what you can see on the screen, actually, these are two images of the same office. This is John Deere's West Office building, designed by Kevin Roach. On the left-hand side, this image, this is from 1979. This is, by the way, a very iconic building because it has this giant garden at the very center of it. It's a very beautiful building, actually. It's really quite impressive to be inside of it. So it has this grand garden, and it is an open plan design. You can see these are the original cubicle workstations, the original furniture that was installed. And notice there are a couple of computer terminals in here. These, by the way, are not personal computers. They would have been connected to a mainframe computer elsewhere in the building. I will get back to that point. But this is important because every single computer in this case had to be carefully planned for this spot. They actually had to put in special power and coaxial cable to support these computers being in these places. So computers were part of the vision. But in 2008, when I visited this office, they still had the same furniture. This is the same furniture. But of course, now you can see there are not just a couple of terminals. There are, just in this image, crowded on this little grouping of desks, right? You see, 4 different monitors, multiple hard drives, keyboards, all of the modern day ephemera of computing as of 2008. If you look at the bottom, look at all those cords, look at all those cables. I point this out because I want you to think about how, and this is part of my story, and part of what I'm talking about, this kind of long line, right? Offices are not just built and then left, they're like hermetically sealed in a capsule, right? They evolve, they change, workers change, the work processes change, organizations change, technology changes. And these changes interface with the design of the space in some fairly significant ways. And this is something that I'm constantly grappling with in my book about this kind of arc that we see with office design and so on. So I want you to keep this in your mind. And in fact, I often like to joke, like if you've ever done yoga, you'll know there's this idea like if you get overworked or get tired, they tell you to go to child's pose, right? So I want you to think of this image, especially this image right here, as our child's pose. If you're like, what is she talking about? Just in your mind, remember this image. This is where we're going. This is what we're kind of focusing on, and how we're kind of trying to understand all of these different dimensions that are evolving, are changing technology, but also changing the office and office design in some fairly significant ways. Okay, computers were absolutely an important transformation of offices that arrived in many ways in parallel with this kind of development and growth of the open plan. And so one of the things I kind of explore in my research, and y'all have read some of it, is how open plan offices, although they were designed around this concept of supporting change and being very flexible, how did that sort of interface with these new technologies that were coming about, especially things like word processing systems and of course personal computers, and the new ways of working that emerged as a result of that. How were these furniture manufacturers responding to computers? How were they trying to understand these new devices in the office and trying to adapt their furniture systems that were not designed for computers to fit with computers and fit with the needs of those users who are now going to be using computers, and then how that changes how office furniture works and what it's meant to do. And then in turn, how does all of this relate to these larger changes about the structure and experience of office work? So this is kind of where we're going to kind of be thinking about and looking at. So to start with the computing side, I do want to say that computers were in offices in the 60s when the open plan first developed. But these computers were what were known as mainframe computers. And it's hard to explain these, but they are giant. In fact, I read an early, one of my primary source materials that I had read when I was first doing this research, something described mainframe computers as large as a horse and as delicate as a flower. And this is because not only were they physically large, and you can see an example here, they were literally room-sized computers, they were huge, but they were fussy. You couldn't just install them anywhere. When companies were buying these computers, they were investing vast resources in buying them because they were very expensive machines. And then they had to build special rooms for them, special rooms with special power, with dedicated HVAC, because you need to keep those really cool. The computer couldn't handle too much heat. So you needed to have a really, really high powered air conditioning system that constantly draw out the heat of that space. You needed a floor that could handle the weight of it because they were quite heavy machines. So they often needed a reinforced flooring. So all this is to say, architecture was an important part of mainframe computing in offices and was an important part of their design. And open plan offices, kinds of offices in the 60s were being built. Mainframe computing, they were in separate spaces, dedicated spaces just for computers. So this was part of how we have to understand what the kind of context of computer usage meant at the time, right? For them, computers were these giant room-sized things. They were not tiny little terminals sitting on a desk, and nor were they imagined to ever be that in any really meaningful way. The other thing that's really important that I want to draw your attention to are some of the organizational elements of mainframe computing, just philosophical things that I want you to have in your mind. One is that by definition and by design, mainframe computing is centralized, right? It is under the ownership of the organization. It's managed by the organization in a very top-down way. And often, if different units in an organization, say the accounting division and the design division, both wanted to do something on the computer, they had to schedule time for that, right? They had to negotiate time to be on the mainframe and time to run various, they were going to run a problem through it or what have you. That it was a shared resource across the organization and across all of the different units of that organization. So this is something to think about. I also just want to say that design part of the mainframe, there was furniture associated with it, but very often those consoles were built into furniture. So there was kind of its own dedicated furniture that was built often in tandem with the mainframe itself that was part of the design. And you can actually see an example here of a console kind of built into a table, pretty typical design from this UNIVAC computer from 1961. So of course, as the 1960s, as the open plan is first kind of getting a lot of attention, there is also some new developments in computing that just start getting attention. And y'all read my Computing the Cubicle article. And so you may remember I opened with the story of the mother of all demos, which I'm sure many of you had not heard of before, but it's one of those stories that in computing history is kind of this iconic moment in a really important moment in the history of computing, because it introduced this very novel computer, and this is Douglas Engelbart, who ran the demo and who ran this Stanford Research Institute lab where they developed this, what was known as the NLS system. And it allowed for this kind of real-time interaction with objects on the screen, sort of essentially like a GUI interface. That was kind of what we think of as a GUI interface. It even had a kind of mouse piece. You can see here, this is before mouses were common in computers, and he actually has kind of a control that is very, very similar to a mouse, with like a pointer and a little selector that he was able to use to manipulate objects on the screen. And I start with this story because when this was introduced, first of all, to the computing industry, it was a bombshell. It was absolutely an extraordinary development. It blew everyone's mind when it first appeared. But the other reason is important is because of the importance of office design, and specifically Herman Miller's design team in helping to create this interface. Part of what gets a lot of attention is the emphasis on ergonomics, the fit of this and the design of it as it fits with the user, in this case, Douglas Engelbart. And in fact, Robert Probst, that head of design research at Herman Miller, and one of his designers, Jack Kelly, they were with Engelbart and they consulted on it and helped him sort of design this stuff. They actually created the kind of plastic prototype that is this interesting swinging keyboard that you see. And you'll notice this is set up inside of an Action Office workstation. And this is interesting because from the beginning, Engelbart really envisioned this as the future of office work. And he really wanted to create the sense of a scene. And so even in that original demo, which is you can even watch the whole demo on YouTube, it is out there. He is set up inside of, at least in part, they used some Action Office screens. And they even did an open house afterwards where people at this conference could come and look at the computer, and they actually created a little Action Office workstation around the computer. So all this is to point out that even in the very beginning, the early stages of this new concept of open plan, as it was getting attention, there had been this idea that technology would be part of the office. There was some sense this might be a thing, and they were already kind of imagining this, at least from an aesthetic direction, even if they hadn't yet figured out some of the technical things that I'm about to talk about. But so one of the kind of actually first issues and first problems that we see associated with the Action Office, or Herman Miller's open plan concept, is the emergence of what's known as word processing. So word processing is really the first major kind of computing automation thing that really begins to interface with the open plan as it was understood at the time. What you can see on the screen, this is an example of Herman Miller's, what they called Action Secretary, which was a line dedicated to the use of word processing systems. And although it's hard to tell, word processing systems were computers, but they were hooked up to typewriters. So you had a regular sort of IBM Selectric typewriter, and it was hooked up. This is actually the memory right here, to this device that could kind of record the keystrokes. So instead of typing just straight to paper, we're typing to a tape or to memory that could then be generated multiple copies. You could easily edit. So it made it a much more efficient way, right? So if you're typing on a piece of paper, type, you make a mistake, you can kind of go back and edit, sort of. But on this, you really could actually line edit, and really change it before you printed it out. Oh, yes, you have a question.
Yes, actually, I have some question going on, but probably I will ask them in the end. And you are sure. Very fluently talking. So, but I just wanted to say, like, can it be the primitive version of like cut and paste or edit things?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I bet every single one of you has used what's known as a word processing program on your computer. Mm-hmm. That is what these machines did. They were designed to do that. That is exactly right. And so our modern day word processing software is really based on the design of this, which kind of came out of the design of this actual hardware that did exactly that. And what's interesting about Action Office or about the word processing system specifically is, like mainframe computing, it was very centralized. Workers were often put in these dedicated areas where they were doing word processing work for, multiple units at a time. So, everybody would kind of send in their dictation or their letters that needed to be written or the reports, and then those would get typed up by these word processing units, mostly staffed by women, and often, very low pay. They were not very good jobs, and not very desirable jobs. And so one of the things that early on Herman Miller begins to promote is this idea of humanizing automation, of making an attractive, desirable space that will help you keep your workers, right? You don't want to keep your worker who is going to be stuck there working on this very expensive machine day in and day out, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would it look like to make an attractive, supportive, idealized office environment? And that was really one of the goals here. And you can see here in this image, like notice all the plant matter. Plants were part of the humanizing, right? Plants are attractive and pretty. You can see here, of course, all the flipper doors. They have these bright, colorful stripes. It's colorful, it's bright. I think this is also a good example of how the kind of, notice all the gentle curves of the Action Office system. This is another way in which it kind of imagines kind of humanizing, right? Because it kind of softens things and kind of makes it attractive and supportive to that worker. And this is kind of one of the themes that we see again and again and again in kind of office planning. And I have a little video, but I don't think we have time for it. But I will post a link to it if any of you are curious. I will share a link at the end, and y'all can watch it on your own. By the way, that video is extraordinary.
That's great. Yeah.
Well worth it. So I do want to shift gears. So obviously we have a word processing. Word processing was entering offices. Again, these were in dedicated units. They weren't just scattered usually all over the office. They usually had a very particular space in the office. They did require certain special amenities to work. They were not what we really think of as computing. It wasn't until the very late 1970s, early 1980s that personal computing really kind of takes off and starts to enter corporate offices in this time period. Personal computing, it's hard to overstate just how extraordinary personal computing, microcomputers were in this period, right? If you think about that room-sized computer, this idea of something that can fit on a desk, a desktop computer, literally just was a transformative idea in many respects. But what's interesting is that at this time, late 70s, early 80s, most companies did not think the future was in personal computing. They still thought that the future was mainframes. And so actually many companies were very slow to adopt personal computing in any large, significant way. Instead, what ended up happening is that because computers were relatively cheap and very flexible, and things that often different units in an organization might have discretionary funds that actually just purchase a computer, what ends up happening is this very grassroots kind of adoption of computers, in little bits and bobs across units, without any coordination, without any planning, often with multiple kinds of computers in a single space. So, this is an example on the screen. This is a company called Radio Shack, which was a very common store that sells a lot of electronic kind of equipment, and wires and little plugs you could do to, if you wanted to fix your electronics, Radio Shack is where you went. And they had their own line of computers, what were known as the TRS-80, and later the Tandy machines. And I have this image because I want to point out a few things. One is these were the kind of things you could buy in your local Radio Shack, right? Your local store. A manager could go to one of these shops. These were all over the country, and purchase a TRS-80 for their office, bring it in, pop it on a desk, set it up, and bing, bang, boom, they were off to the races. They could start computing right away, right out of the box. They buy some software, whether it was a spreadsheet program, whether it was a database program, whatever they were going to use that computer for, they could just get it, set it up, and it was kind of, they would use it often for these very, very specific unit level needs. And this is important because part of what you start to see in this period is just this utter miscellany of computing equipment, all different kinds of, all different makes, models, all different shapes and sizes, used for all different kinds of purposes. Some of them are shared, some of them are used by individual workers. It is very idiosyncratic. It is very ad hoc. If any of you have ever worked in an organization, or frankly, probably at your own university right now, you probably are familiar with the idea of the IT department that mandates and controls what computers you can buy, what software you can have, when you do updates on your operating system, perhaps. That was not the case in this period. IT departments didn't yet exist in this way. They managed the mainframes, but for the most part, these other computers, they were completely off the network. And there wasn't really a network actually at this point. They didn't yet have networked computers in the same way that we did later by the later 80s and 90s when they start really networking. So you just have this really interesting moment where it's very, very kind of, there's a real miscellany of computing equipment. Yes. You have a question?
I'm sorry, I might have missed. What was the idiosyncratic quality exactly of the early personal computers? What was so idiosyncratic?
Yeah, to be more specific, thank you for asking that. Yes. So there's two things. One is the design themselves. When we look at computers, and actually you can see this on this example pretty well, I think here, which is computers came in a lot of different form factors. So some had, for example, were all-in-one machines where the screen, almost like what we think of as a laptop actually, but for a desktop, where the screen, the keyboard, the hard drive are all one thing. Some of them had an integrated screen with a hard drive, but the keyboard was separate. Some had an integrated screen and keyboard with the hard drive. They just vary anyway, all different configurations, all different makes and models. There wasn't any standardization. And so computing equipment can look really vastly different depending on what model you got, depending on when you purchased it. And so there's just this real unevenness in what computers were, as well as how they were used. And so that idiosyncrasy, both the organizational level, the fact that they're sort of buying a lot of different computing models and computing types and not really concerned about standardization. Computers didn't need to talk to each other. So it didn't matter if you had a Radio Shack over here, a Radio Shack computer over there, and an Apple computer, a new Apple Macintosh over there, and an IBM somewhere else. They weren't talking to each other. So it almost didn't matter that those were separate machines. They were kind of little islands of information. And this was kind of just part of the kind of landscape of computing at the organizational level in this period. Does that make sense?
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad. Thank you for asking questions. It's really helpful. It keeps me grounded. So as these computers started coming in larger numbers and becoming more important to office work, they do present a number of design challenges. And I do want to talk about some of these design challenges and think through some of them. The first of which, of course, is space. They are bulky. I mean, yes, they are so-called microcomputers and personal computers, but they are not anything like the laptops that you may be using right now, right? They are large machines. And you can actually kind of see that on this image. I think this is from Hayworth's Unigroup collection. This is from 1980. So these are very early computing devices, so-called VTs, as they're often called, the visual display terminals. These computers required a lot more space. In addition, it wasn't just the computer, right? If you had a computer, you not only did you need the monitor, a hard drive, and keyboard, and disk drives. You might need a printer. You might need a micro, they had various kinds of micro viewers. They had all kinds of media associated with them, tape drives, as well as paper printouts. I mean, there was just so much stuff, right? And it's ironic because when people talked about the future of computing, they often imagined a future of a paperless office, or as if all the stuff that, didn't have any media associated with it. But actually, it just led to an explosion of stuff, right? It took up more room, not less room than paper, right? At this time, right? There are these bulky machines. And so yeah, really bulky. And back to this previous point about the idiosyncrasy, right? All these machines too, they have different sizes and shapes and configurations. How, as a furniture maker, you design a piece of furniture that can accommodate, 50 different computer types of all different shapes and sizes that have all different form factors, right? This is really challenging. So to respond to this, we start to see a few kind of typologies of furniture used by the major furniture manufacturers to address kind of the immediate needs for computing. And some of the first actually are these computer carts and computer tables. These are like dedicated, surfaces for computing. This is from Kruger International on the left, a computer cart. You can see it's on wheels. That's why it's called a cart. It can roll around the office to where you need it. And this is a computer table. You can it's on like a regular pedestal piece. It has kind of, notice both of them actually have this split desk element. And we're going to come back to that. But that's an important feature of a lot of these computing devices because of this idea of separating as much as possible the the visual height, the monitor height from the typing height. So I will come back to that point. But these were some of the early kind of immediate solutions. They don't integrate with systems furniture, which was, very modular and everything was kind of integrated into the system. Instead, these were sort of accessories, basically, that you would get to support that new computer so that it wasn't just sitting on a desk where it might not fit very well. So it allowed for more flexibility. It could handle the weight of a computer as well better. Integrated systems furniture, work surfaces couldn't handle the weight of a computer very often. And so these were important too, because they were a little more supportive of that equipment, which was quite bulky and quite heavy. So this
Jennifer,
is one.
sorry.
No,
What
yeah.
is the surface between the screen and the keyboard? Is it for putting the papers to?
Oh, this right here. Yeah, good observation. Yes, that is exactly right. It is your source material. Like if you were typing something, that's where that text would be that you're typing from. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Actually, it looks helpful still.
Absolutely. I'll show you some more examples of those. They are a really important feature. And it does point to all the ways in which there was like many parts to the system to understand it. Absolutely. So the really big innovation though, in terms of office furnishings, and especially this new systems furniture concept that had, started to become the dominant form of office design by this time, was the concept of the VDT corner, this visual display corner. And it's a very unusual design, but it's worth thinking about what it is, right? So if a cubicle or a workstation of this sort, you can see there's the partitions, right? And then these panels that are kind of hung from the partition. Usually,
sorry, Jennifer. So finally, we can see modular computers like you had talked about previously, that the computers with different brands had diverse design qualities, and furniture makers had difficulties to design study desks or computing desks.
Yeah.
So can we say that now there is a modularization or some kind of standardization by means of computer designs?
Somewhat, but one of the problems is that because computers were used for a really long time, all those old computers that were of different forms were still around and still in use. So actually, to your point, so this image makes it look like, this is a marketing image. So it looks like this is very modern, right? But in a real office, of course, we all know like computers can sometimes be used for a really long time. I've worked on some really old computers in my previous jobs, right? So they needed to be able to address, I think, exactly that, the space issues, these different form factors still in their design. And this is what actually made the VDT corner so useful. What the VDT corner did, and as an innovation in this kind of planning of the workstation, it took the unused corner of a workstation where you had the greatest depth actually from the kind of work surface back to that corner, which usually would have been a spot where there was a seam. Usually there would be a seam. You wouldn't set something on top of that seam, right? The connecting point of two different work surfaces to create that L form like that, right? That's how it usually would be in the corner. So instead, it takes that corner and it creates this very distinctive VDT corner that slots right in. It has more support because it's a shorter work surface. So it has brackets underneath here that support the heavier weight of that computing equipment. And because it's deeper, it can handle the depth of a CRT monitor, these deeper style monitors. Of course, this is pre-flat screen. So the bigger your monitor, the deeper it is. And that actually is the biggest barrier, right? As monitors get bigger and bigger, the CRT screen, the depth of it gets deeper and deeper to accommodate the greater size. So we do see this really important innovation. So the VDT corner is great because it creates this really kind of flexible use of this new design that offers a new kind of work surface for furniture makers and for organizations, that they can update their cubicles with these new types of work surfaces. So they're pretty interesting, and they become very ubiquitous. Every maker has their own VDT corner. The other kind of interesting kind of space issue concerns the problem of shared computers. At this time, although that previous image made it seem like, there's a computer on every desk. In practice, actually, computers were still definitely not on every desk, and often they were these shared things that had to be rotated or moved around the office, or workers were coming and going. And so furniture manufacturers also start creating some really interesting devices to facilitate sharing. Both of these, actually, what you see in these two images, one from Hayworth, one from Herman Miller, are turntables that allow a computer to turn around to serve different workstations in a space. You'll see arms that can kind of allow a computer to move from workstation to workstation. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of solutions that revolve around this idea of the mobile computer and this computer as a shared device. And again, this is a space issue too, right? Because you have to think about where is that computer and how is it moving between workers, or how are workers moving to it or away from it, et cetera, right? So these two kind of space issues that had to be kind of conceptualized, and that furniture again was doing some of the work of kind of transforming this technology.
So Jennifer, can we say that the tables were revolving around the computers?
Yeah, or the computer, the computer revolves, not the tables. So the computer is sitting on this, on this little platform, on this little, you can see it right here, and it just turns around like a lazy. Yeah, so you can see it kind of flip around. And this one here, you can see this has like, these are two workstations, and there's like a opening between them, and this computer could just turn around to be on either side. So either worker could theoretically access.
So the computer is seated on the turntables. And
it rotates. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right. That's pretty interesting. So it's an interesting design. And again, you can see them trying to kind of work through. And actually, this is a good example of where this one's from 1982, this one's from 1989. But you can see just there's a lot of different physical elements of the computing, right? Computing equipment really looks very different.
Interesting design problem of 80s.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a huge design problem. And that brings us to the other design problem, which are power and cable issues. So, so in the early open plan offices, like power was they were basically just raceways. And like literally here, what you're seeing is like an extension cord that's basically just run through. They're just linked extension cord, daisy chained extension cords plugged into extension cords, That's how they manage power in a lot of these early open plan offices. So it was really just managing wires. They weren't powered partitions. But one of the things we start to see as computers become more common is the need for more power. Most open plan offices were designed for the common technologies of the day, things like typewriters and lights and dictaphones, not computers. And computers require a lot of power, not only for the computer itself, but of course for all of its peripherals. And one of the reasons why a computer is different from, say, a typewriter that also had to be plugged in is that, unlike a typewriter, where if a glitch happens in your power, you don't lose all of your information, right? It's typed on the page. So if there's a little brownout and you suddenly lose power on your typewriter, what you just typed is still sitting there. But if that happens on your computer, it's gone, right? Like if you have a sudden power outage, like your computer's dead, right? It's done. Whatever you just did is not saved. And if any of you have ever lost a document from not saving it, you can imagine the horror that people would experience when the unstable power would suddenly create these little brownouts and cause their entire computer to go dead in the middle of.
It's very scary, actually.
Right? I mean, it's of course. It is a nightmare, and you can imagine how frustrating that would be. So this really was an enormous problem, how to deal with the power issues of these new office office machines. And so one of the kind of new innovations were these ideas of pre-wired partitions. And this is actually the very first one. And you can see this is the image from my opening slide. This is the ERA1, which was the first fully wired office partition. It was pre-wired. It had this little section at the bottom that snapped together to create a circuit that allowed for kind of much more expansive power. And very soon, all of the furniture manufacturers had their own version of these pre-wired power panels. And they kind of kept expanding in terms of power. So the early ones had like one circuit, and then they had two circuits, and then they had four circuits. And just to show you kind of what the technical complexity of these are from the Noel Morrison furniture system. So this is their power line. And you can see on the one hand, here is the drawing, and you can see where those, where the technical components of that electrical element fit at the bottom of a partition. And then this is the diagram showing the wiring system that you needed to manage all the different wires and circuits and how to organize your computer, your light, things like your calculator onto different circuits to protect them. So this is showing you this idea of kind of isolating your computing equipment away from other things that might cause interference and balancing the power among workstations so that none of the workstations get overloaded, causing a brownout or an outage of your computing equipment or interference with your computing equipment. Because by the way, computers are still pretty fussy and sensitive. And so electrical interference could also cause glitching, which again, you know, your computer glitches and you've lost everything. So this is a really pretty important, important element of the design. Very important, but technically complex. And this is another kind of theme that I talk about a lot in my research, which is just there's this way in which it's presented as this magical thing. You snap together and the partitions just work and you have power and it's amazing and it expands the power of your building. And then in practice, it's like this super complicated system requiring, you know, electrical planning and careful management of all of these different devices. And, you know, there's a real gap between the fantasy of how these systems worked and their reality, how they actually manifest in real time. I know I'm like, I know there's so much, and I know I'm like running out of time. See, didn't I tell you I could just talk and talk and talk?
No worries.
But
it's very fluent and your energy is very good for us.
A little much sometimes, maybe. So I'll just skip ahead. So just to say the last piece, and this is really well, I'll stop here, which is just, of course, about supporting workers and about the physical interface of the computing to the human, to the body, to the user. And this was another important piece, right? As a period, in addition to the space issues, in addition to the power issues, there were emerging concerns among workers about all of the pains, the physical problems that came with computers to people's health. People were having, back pain, neck pain, shoulder pain, wrist pain, eye issues, migraines and headaches from looking at computers. And there's increasing emphasis on using or thinking about how furniture could help ameliorate some of the problems of these devices and their harm to the body. Right. And in fact, I will tell you, the computer industry was super invested in not taking any of the blame for the problems that their devices created for people, and instead saying that it was the office furniture that was the problem. And office furniture manufacturers were actually okay with this because this gave them an excuse to buy or to sell more office furniture, to say, oh, yes, okay, so there's a misfit between the machine and your furniture and your user. We'll just create more flexible furniture and voila, it's fixed. And so we see a whole host of new kind of computing equipment designed to fix problems like these. And this is actually just an example to show you all of the ways in which workers' bodies were adjusting to these computer environments, right? They were slouched, they were stretching over awkwardly across multiple work surfaces and things. They were hunched over, they were, in all these various states of discomfort, right? So you can see like they were really physically being harmed by the mismatch between the computing equipment and many of these kind of standard work environments of this period.
So Jennifer, the balconies of those computers in 70s or 80s was also a factor for having these bodily issues.
Absolutely, they're bulky. They don't fit on regular furniture, and you can see they're really not. There's so little adjustability to the equipment and so little adjustability to the furniture that they really are kind of bodies are having to do the work of making the fit happen between this technology and that human, right? The worker is having to sort of adjust themselves to fit.
Sorry, maybe the workers are twisting their bodies to fit in with the those times computers.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Their bodies are doing the manipulating, right? Because the machines are not. Machines, most of them don't even have keyboard adjustment. They don't have monitor adjustments. Like there's like no built-in adjustability to these machines at all.
Mhm.
And
And
so,
sorry, and one thing, that maybe they have more hours because computers those times might be slower, or as you say, when the power is gone, immediately all the document is corrupted, and they have to do it again. Maybe
absolutely.
more hours with those uncomfortable postures.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And I think, you know, the strain really, especially on these intensive computer users, is hard to overstate. It was really a very stressful job, for all kinds of reasons. And increasingly we do see this emergence of kind of ergonomic elements, ergonomic furniture to support computer usage. Things like the split typing screen versus viewing height. So these split desks that allow for a more comfortable typing height relative to the viewing height. Which you can see here, one of the most important things, right? That ergonomic chair. And all of this becomes part of the kind of way in which office manufacturers are trying to sort of, again, humanize the office in this case, and humanize the technology to make it more suitable for all of these different users. And I will stop there because I've already talked way too much. Here, I'll skip ahead. See, I had so much. I had too much. There we go. Here, the cube.
Okay.
It's not a job, it's a way of life. Do you have time for some questions? I know you had such great questions while we were chatting, so I don't know if there are others from the students.
Sorry, have you finished?
Yeah, I was just going to wrap up because I thought we're kind of out of time, right? I wanted to make sure there's time for questions. So I thought I'd just wrap up and let you, open it up to questions.
Okay, let's give the priority to the students. Students, do you have any questions or comments about the history of the office and the technology and the computer ergonomics?
Here, I'll stop sharing just so. Oops.
Oh, you stop sharing.
Oh yeah, that way you can I can see everyone. Well, I mean, I can see all the blank screens.
Okay, let's turn on the cameras. Students.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It doesn't matter if they don't want to. I understand. Oh, hey, look.
There's no
time.
Yeah.
Look at that. It's nice to see human faces always.
Yeah. Did you like this presentation?
Like she talked really way too fast and there was too much information. I know, I'm sorry. Apologies for that.
No worries. It's very fluent and understandable. And they also have this concentration of focus. I can ask a question. First of all, in the you talk about the conventional office first, and there was a transition to the open office. So did you, through your research, have you ever found out the first reactions or the first perceptions of the open office experience by the workers or the professionals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when the first open plan offices were released or developed, implemented, I guess is the word, when they were first implemented, some organizations and some workers were really excited about it. It really was, again, this very progressive idea. And so this idea of an office without walls really seemed transformative at the time. And part of one of the ideals of it, really, that I didn't talk very much about was this idea of flattening hierarchies, that everyone was in this open plan, right? There were no more private offices. Everyone would be in this open environment. And that was seen as this very, very progressive idea. So interestingly, workers were really initially quite excited about the open plan, and it had all of this sheen of kind of very progressive kind of ideas about it. And there was actually a lot of excitement around it, and especially among like kind of lower level workers, clerical workers. Remember, clerical workers already were in these giant bullpen offices. They were already basically in open plans. These open plans were seen as like more attractive and more supportive and more egalitarian for those workers. So there was, on the one hand, this real, especially early on, this kind of sheen of it being very desirable. Now, I will tell you, professional workers were not very excited about giving up private offices. And in fact, most of the research at the time and most of the concerns among architects and designers was the executive worker who, or the knowledge worker, as they were sometimes called, who had to give up their private enclave to come sit in this open environment. They worked so hard to get those private offices, and now they had to give them up. And it was seen as this real insult, right, to them. And so there was a lot of concern about those folks. And interestingly, architects and designers did not care about their complaints very much, right? They were mostly like, they'll get used to it. In fact, some of them, people like Robert Probst, would say things like, well, anybody who is that concerned about being in a private office is probably trying to hide their poor performance. They're just scared that someone's going to catch them not working. And so if they were really like good citizens, good corporate citizens, they will embrace this idea and appreciate all of its benefits, and not be so shallow and silly as to be hung up on this private office idea. You do see this real kind of cynicism about it, that from the architects and designers who are like, oh, they'll get used to it. They'll get used to it. But it's interesting because some organizations, and I think this is one of the problems that I kind of grapple with a lot in my research, which is the importance of organizational context, right? What an open plan meant in a very progressive organization that was very supportive with workers who were very invested in it was very different from a place where it was maybe imposed top down as a way of shrinking office space and squeezing, people into smaller and smaller workspaces, right? So these are very different kinds of contexts. And I think part of the way we have to understand these is through the lens of those organizational realities and the sort of on the ground experience that's so important. And I will just in that afterthought just point out that of course by the 80s, as we see the kind of cube farm, right, the rows and rows and rows of drab gray cubicle enclosed workstations, it really becomes kind of a symbol of all the things that were kind of wrong with the open plan, kind of isolation, the dreariness, the drabness of it, the sort of bureaucracy of it, completely counter to this kind of very idealistic vision from when it started. That was a long-winded answer.
Yeah, very good explanation. Thank you very much for clarifying this issue. And I will again ask and raise another issue that, for example, one of the first motivations of the open office seems like the providing the communication through the workers and professionals, and but just after that, or in the following consequences, we see that there is a huge effort to make a privatization of the cubicle, like we are in communication, but also we want to have our privacy, and so the panels and the post-it note surfaces or the dividers, partitions.
Yes.
It seems a bit ironic, but also it is a logic. Actually, I can understand that.
Yeah, no, it is such an important question. I'm so glad you asked it. And this is something I grapple with in my book too, right? This tension between that ideal of easy, effortless communication. Yeah. And then the reality, right? That part of the reason the partitions go up and up and up is growing kind of sort of, first of all, growing problems with sound. One of the biggest complaints, this connects back to the previous question, right? One of the frequent and most perennial complaints workers had about the open plan was it was noisy. They were loud. There was no partitions. And so just sound everywhere, right? And often some of these were done in very cheap ways without all of the sound control things that they were supposed to put in place. So the best examples of an open plan office often actually had heavy duty acoustic elements, right? They had acoustic ceilings. They had carpet on the floor. They even had carpet on the walls in some cases. They had partitions that actually were acoustic partitions. Some of those some things that look like acoustic partitions, they are not acoustic partitions. I actually used to work in an office where the partitions, the inner part of the inner sleeve of the partition was metal. That is not going to be acoustic. So you do see some things that look acoustic and aren't acoustic, which is a whole other thing. But so sound is this real issue. And interestingly, at the time when they first started promoting the open plan, they sort of knew that, which is why they were promoting all the kind of acoustic features and things like white noise machines as part of the design of an open plan office to be successful. So they kind of knew that. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is how architects and designers really tried to make the claim that privacy and sound, that our notion of what acoustic privacy is, like this idea, first of all, of hearing and being overheard, right? So the problem of this, of the central problem that we might think of as being the acoustic problem of the office, which is both the privacy piece and the noise piece, that workers just had an irrational idea of what privacy is, that you could have privacy and that you could have a comfortable environment with sufficient sound controls. And actually, interestingly, they thought that a more populated, noisy office was better for privacy than a quieter, smaller office, because you kind of got lost in the sound. They would often make the claim, for example, that you could have a private conversation, like you can have a private conversation in a noisy restaurant, right? You had the sense of privacy because there's all this stuff happening around you, but nobody's listening to you. There's too many other things going on. And there was this kind of idea that if we could just change people's way of thinking about what privacy is, they will feel that they have greater privacy and greater kind of control over that space. But again, noise is not just about privacy. It is also about concentration. It's about a whole host of other things. And by the 1980s, research had come around that it actually said that most people find themselves freer to communicate with more privacy. And so in response, we see this kind of creeping up of partition as this research becomes kind of more mainstream. And you really see, this idea of like a standing height partition or taller to really not only block views, but block sound and give people the sense of privacy, which becomes so important to the design. It's really seen as a way of improving the design. But of course, then ironically, those high partitions become symbols of isolation, even though they were actually put in place actually to facilitate supposedly better communication, allowing for more private interactions. So I don't know. It's an impossible. There's no squaring it, right? They're mutually exclusive problems in many ways.
Thank you again. That was a very in-depth answer. Thank you. And about I think that contemporary privacy booths can be a case for understanding that privacy issues in the open office also normally in the cubicles, in a conventional cubicles today, when a worker or a professional wants to make a private call or be more isolated than the cubicle can provide, they can go to the privacy booths, and there is a tremendous efforts and attempts for designing new privacy booths, even today's office furniture design world.
Yeah. Although it's what I understand from people who offices that have used those is that they get people want privacy so badly that they're constantly booked and constantly being used, sometimes by people doing, just needing to be out of the space. Like there's so many ways in which they're so desirable. People want privacy or want to escape from all that openness so badly sometimes. Never mind, I will just point out like things like lactation rooms, where like a lack of space for things where you really do need privacy that, it's not supported in the open plan. And so some of those spaces also end up being used for a host of other like really important things that you need privacy for. So I think there are a lot of competing needs and requirements that frankly most offices do not serve the diverse needs of people very well.
Exactly.
That's just a truth. That's just a truth. That's just it. That's just the truth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one more comment I will finalize. For example, in the working cultures, there's this control issue that the boss or the director is meant to control the other workers. So, for example, in some big scale companies, there are these privacy booths, etc. They are placed at other parts of the open office, let's say, and but being in them so often can be although they are designed for private working, might be again a negative impression for the gaze of the director. But so in some of the companies, we see that these privacy booths are usually empty. So, I mean, I don't know, there can be some, maybe some more design anthropology researchers can be made about this private booths.
I think this is a great example of where organizational culture really matters, right? What are the practices and norms? In some places, it might be seen as problematic to enter those spaces. What are you hiding, right? So it might look suspicious, in a certain kind of environment, where others it might be more welcome. I will say too, if you've ever been in one of those tiny booths, they are not pleasant places to be. I have my to your point about some of them being empty all the time. My older brother, before pre-pandemic times, in his very techie office in LA, they had a series of these, and nobody ever wanted to be in them. They were small, they had no air circulation, they were hot and stuffy. And if you had anywhere else you could go to have your conversation that was not those booths, you went there, because they were just such unpleasant environments to be in, especially for a long haul. Like, you just did not want to be in there. They smelled like they were very unpleasant. So I do think
not attractive at all.
Yeah, I know. And I did visit his office, and I was like, oh, I see what you mean. When I went in them, I was like, yeah, I would not want to spend my time talking on the phone in this room. It sounds like hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I'm glad that it's not my life. I'll just say that.
I know. Yes, Jennifer, thank you very much for your wonderful session. It was so energetic, so fluent, and so full of information, and it was very in-depth, actually. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book completely, actually. It is in my reading list, by the way.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your research and works and publications about subject matter. And it's a very important subject, actually, and it is not very often studied, actually. When I first saw your book, I saw, wow, this is a very important subject to study on. And you really opened our vision even more today. Thank you very much.
Oh. Good. Thank you so much. Well, this was really fun, and hopefully it was useful. And, let me know if you have any follow-up questions or anything else. I'm happy to, respond. So thanks.
Yeah. And our students also, thank you very much. And students, if you have any questions in your minds later on, you can still forward me, and I can communicate with Jennifer again, and we can try to respond. It was a really great talk. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and being here today. We are very delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Take care, y'all. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hope to meet again. I'm stopping the recording now.